Now let's talk about blood glucose regulation. As you'll recall, when it comes to starch, glucose is the only monosaccharide used to build starch in plants. Meanwhile, glucose is one half of disaccharides in the diet. Therefore, most of the monosaccharides that are absorbed from digestible carbohydrates will be glucose. Plus, glucose will be the primary monosaccharide that circulates in the blood, and the body will regulate the level of glucose that circulates. So when food carbohydrate like starch and disaccharides are digested, monosaccharides are absorbed. This increases blood glucose levels. Plus, on the way to the blood, monosaccharides flow through the liver first, and the liver will take up monosaccharides, primarily fructose and galactose, but also a lot of the glucose. As blood glucose levels increase, insulin is released from the pancreas, and insulin will promote the uptake of glucose into muscle as well as into adipose tissue. Meanwhile, insulin will promote the storage of glucose in the liver in the form of glycogen. The muscle has a capacity to store about 300 to 400 grams of glucose as glycogen. The liver has a capacity to store about 75 to 100 grams of glucose in the form of glycogen. Meanwhile, fasting blood glucose levels are right around 5 grams for an adult male, and as blood glucose levels increase after a meal, it can go to 6 grams and possibly higher. The body works hard by releasing insulin to try to knock down that level of glucose and get it back to a fasting or normal or desirable blood glucose level within a couple of hours. It's also important to remember that insulin can help drive glucose into adipose tissue. There's minimal storage of glucose as glycogen, and when carbohydrate is in excess, adipose tissue or fat tissue can begin to convert excess glucose to fat. The same is true within the liver. The liver can begin to convert it to triglycerides, which are added to a lipoprotein which is released into the blood. To be able to visualize and measure the effects of a standardized level of carbohydrate and the actions of insulin, we can provide individuals with a standardized level of glucose in the form of a drink or the starch in white bread. Then we take blood measures of glucose at timely increments throughout a 3-hour period. This is referred to as an oral glucose tolerance test. Over those 3 hours, blood glucose levels will elevate quickly and then they'll become lowered over time. This is the actions of insulin driving glucose into skeletal muscle, driving storage in the liver, as well as driving some glucose into adipose tissue or fat tissue. The effect a food has on blood glucose levels is referred to as the glycemic response. Foods can vary in how high they increase blood glucose levels or whether or not they do it at all. The degree and length of the glycemic response depends on the carbohydrate content and the type of carbohydrate that is consumed, how much food is consumed, and any other foods that are consumed at the same time or in proximity. The glycemic index is a standardized measure of the glycemic response. The glycemic index is the blood glucose response to a food versus glucose or white bread at the same level. The grams of digestible carbohydrate are matched, 25 or 50 or 75 grams. And foods are categorized as being either high glycemic, medium, or low glycemic index. In addition to glycemic index is glycemic load. Glycemic load differs from glycemic index in that the test quantity used is based on a portion of a food versus consuming a food to a level of digestible carbohydrate. Glycemic load is a better predictor of glycemic response for lower carbohydrate foods. The categories still remain though high, medium, and low. And glycemic load can be used as a daily tool. And that concludes the second module of the ISSN Sport Nutrition Specialist Certification course. Be sure to review the summary before moving on to Module 3.